Well, fuck, we lost Peter.
Can you hear me? Most of what you just said cut out, Peter. I can hear you now. I heard the first word, none of the middle, and then the last word.
We've lost him again.
No.
Now he's offline. Luckily, I don't have to edit this one till I'm back from vacation.
It's a problem for future Jeremy.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me now?
Welcome to I'd Buy That for $1, a podcast about inexpensive, common, and underappreciated records that are waiting to be rediscovered. I'm your co-host, Sean Hartman, creative director for the upcoming box set compilation Fire Waltz With Me, Classical Impressions of Twin Peaks.
I'd buy that for $3 even.
Well, for only 4 low payments of $39.95.
I'd buy that for twin dollars.
Ooh, I outbid Peter. I'm co-host Jeremy Ruggles, curator and autographer of topographical mappery.
Oh, I'm glad I almost used curator in my title. I'm glad I went a different route. I'm Peter Cook, seeker of the best Claude Monet impression. Get it?
Oh.
I see what we all did there. We all did some things.
We sure did.
I think we were giving a little jab at the academic world there, huh?
I believe you're right.
Giving a little knock on those ivory towers, if you know what I
Is
mean.
nothing
That
sacred.
leads us right into what we came to talk about, doesn't it? Taking jabs at the academic world.
What are we going to talk about?
True or false, are we going to talk about the origin and true creator of krautrock?
Yeah, that's what we came to talk about and reveal to the world.
Ravel.
Are you saying that krautrock was invented by a Frenchman?
Yes,
Scandalous.
truly.
Yeah, I brought Ravel, Bolero, and Mother Goose Suite, the release on RCA Victor Red Seal in 1950. I'd like to state a little disclaimer up front that if you are new to I'd Buy That for $1 and came looking for scholarly analysis on Ravel, this ain't the place. But if you want to hear enthusiasm over inexpensive used LPs, look no further. Because, none of us claim to, by any means, be scholars on classical music. Or are we even connoisseurs in any way? Or any of you? I don't own more than a dozen or so in my collection.
I'm a hopeful future connoisseur. I've got, a couple random ones that I picked up at thrift stores, either because it sounded familiar or the artwork was cool, but I rarely put classical on, and I've been thinking for a few years now that, I want to start digging in and really become knowledgeable about classical music.
Yeah, I hope to also have some kind of awakening. I'm now into my 40s. It's about time, I think.
Exactly. It's time. Well, in the meantime, I'm ready for some enthusiasm. So
Plant some seeds.
that's right.
So I'd like to actually start not with Bolero. I want to start with Mother Goose Suite, the second track on side B, Little Ugly Girl, Empress of the Pagodas. We're going to start there with Maurice Ravel.
That sounds like Ravel. And I have to say, I'm familiar with Ravel, and I had an idea in my head what Ravel sounds like. And then you said you wanted to do Bolero, and I was like, oh, I know Bolero. And then I listened to it, and I'm like, that doesn't sound like Ravel. I had never connected that he did that piece of music. But this is, I would say, historically what Ravel sounds like.
That's why I wanted to start here, to get an idea of what his music more traditionally sounded like. Good observation, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Jeremy gets 1 gold star so far.
Yes.
Yes, keep track of your gold stars, Jeremy.
It's of scholarly importance for me to keep track.
Indeed. So the Mother Goose Suite that we just heard a part of was written in 1910 by Maurice Ravel as a 5-movement piano duet. The following year, he orchestrated this suite, and the different movements are based on different fairy tales. There's Sleeping Beauty, Little Tom Thumb, Beauty and the Beast. This part we just heard is inspired by the French fairy tale The Green Serpent, which I don't think that one's translated over to the United States. All those other ones are very familiar names. But, you could hear whimsy in there, I'm sure, and a lot of variation in tone. And I'm actually, honestly, before researching for this, I don't think I was very familiar with much of Ravel's work other than Bolero. So I was very surprised to hear stuff like this with a lot of coloring, variation. I guess orchestration in particular was, if he had a strong suit, and he had many, but right at the top of that was orchestration, not only his own pieces, but other people's. He was very well known for just being a master of orchestrating pieces.
Yeah, the Impressionists are known for textural focus in their pieces. And they're also known for not liking the tag impressionist.
Yeah.
Both Debussy and Ravel did not like being called that. But yeah, it's like, in my brain at least, it tends to be slower, floaty, and very like texturally changing constantly.
Yeah, what I was reading is that there's a lot of dynamic shifts to make you focus less on the individual parts and more on the general vibe of the whole piece, basically, which is kind of my favorite way to listen to a lot of music. So I was struck pretty early on in researching for this episode how much I actually really enjoyed a lot of the work from Ravel that I was hearing. Yeah, that focus on that texture and that slow moving shifts, especially with Bolero, was right up my alley.
Mm-hmm. So I guess, we usually ask what our backgrounds are or prior knowledge of the artists that we cover on here. And, Jeremy's stated his, you stated yours as well, Sean, more or less. Is there anything else you want to say about your background with
I didn't state anything.
Well, you stated that
You just
You seem to know a lot. You said that you were familiar with pieces other than Bolero, which I'd say is more than a lot of people can say.
Yeah, I had a phase in high school. I did a couple like music theory classes that kind of sparked this interest in classical that lasted a few years, and it predates any of my record collecting though. So I only have like 12 or so classical records in my collection. But I had a heavy phase of studying the history and all that. I had almost a year straight in high school where every night I went to bed listening to Verklärte Nacht by Schoenberg. So,
Damn, you were getting cultured early on.
yeah, I know a little bit about classical. A lot of it's faded through the years of devastating my brain.
Well, that's cool though. It's admirable what you did with your young self there. Sean, did you have any more you wanted to say about your background with Ravel or classical in general?
I have a weird relationship with classical where I've priced so many classical records over the years and seen a lot of names and have some like vague general impressions of things from that, but I don't put on the music enough, and I couldn't tell you what the different composers sound like for the most part, or even like where their place in history and who their contemporaries are. The whole thing just kind of seems overwhelming and confusing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the few artists that like I know I really like and constitutes like a lot of the classical records that I own is Mahler. I forget where I even really first was like, yep, this is a guy that I like, and I'm going to pick up some records. But I definitely kind of noticed some similarities stylistically between the Mahler records that I've listened to and the Ravel stuff. So I'm into this.
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot myself about classical music, except I kind of do because my brother, he was immersed in that world when we were teenagers. He started playing piano, got really into classical music composition. He went all the way with it, went to school for it. Yeah, he's a professional musician. What's up, Jonathan Cook? I don't think I brought him up on the podcast yet, so just got to give him a shout out. I reached out to him before this, with any suggestions or ideas, and he just knows too much for me to have reached out last minute to him, trying to get some pointers, where to start. So I know a lot of names, and I know more pieces when I hear them than I realize I do, just hearing him play them in the house growing up. And I was just so into my rock and roll kick that, different worlds, different paths that we went down. But this piece came to my attention a little over a decade ago. It was actually, this LP was sitting in a collection of freebies that was at the radio station that both Sean and I DJ'd at, WIDR, Kalamazoo. And it was just a box of records, and Brad Miller, another DJ at the station, was flipping through them, and he's pulling them out. Hey, do you know this one? Do you know this one? He handed me 3 or 4, and this was one of them. I, didn't know it by name. I took it home, and I put it on, and I think I recognized the general theme of Bolero, but didn't really understand the greater importance of the piece or what made it so unique at the time. And maybe a year later, when my wife and I had started dating, she, being an avid podcast listener, was showed me an episode of Radio Lab that I know Jeremy has heard on Ravel.
Yeah, shout out to Radiolab. We just like to bring some of the smaller podcasters into the spotlight here at I'd Buy That for $1.
Yeah.
Help them get a leg up.
Yep, give Radiolab a little bump. They had an episode called Unraveling Bolero, and I'm not going to go into what that's about. I'm just going to say it's worth checking out. It's only 25 minutes or so. I did listen to it again, as did Jeremy, in preparation for this. But yeah, Ravel. Let's talk a little bit about Ravel. Maurice Ravel was born Joseph Maurice Ravel, March 7th, 1875, in France. His father was an engineer, and his mother was from an old Basque family, which are the Basque are indigenous to Basque country, which straddles the border between France and Spain. And Ravel's mother encouraged him to pursue music. In 1889, when he was 14, Ravel began taking courses at the Paris Conservatoire, a prestigious music and dance school located in the capital of France, studying under Gabriel Fauré, who was one of the most foremost French composers of his generation. Fauré, as a teacher at the Paris Conservatoire, had fostered in his pupils harmonic sensibility as well as crafty compositional techniques, but he never gave them strict guidelines for composing according to his style. And many of Fauré's students each took drastically different individualistic directions. Ravel remembered Fauré for being very open-minded, and just one of the noteworthy students of Fauré is Ravel. So when Ravel left the Conservatoire in his early 20s, he began to carve his own path as a composer. He met Claude Debussy, as we mentioned before. They both created a new style known as Impressionism. Of course, as Jeremy mentioned, they both rejected this term. It's noteworthy for its dreamlike quality. It gives you the sense of floating, very colorful music, flowery orchestration with lots of development. However, Ravel liked to experiment with musical form, as he does in his best-known work, mentioned many times already, Bolero, in which repetition takes the place of development. So Bolero is a one-movement orchestral piece. There are two melodies that repeat in sections of two over and over as it gradually builds. So at this juncture, if y'all are ready, I'm into playing the first couple minutes of Bolero.
Let's do it.
Okay.
I'm ready. That being the very famous piece in classical music history, I definitely recognized the melody in part, but this was probably the first time where I'd really listened to the song in full or a little more carefully. And the thing I really noticed, my first impressions there, was that your attention and focus changes kind of naturally throughout the song, or at least it did for me. There's like different instruments that kind of naturally grab my attention at points. And then like as it gets louder, I would focus on different parts of it or kind of lose track of focusing on it in detail and kind of taking the general impression, and then something would kind of shift my focus. I don't know if you guys had that experience listening to it, but
One thing I noticed in giving it my full attention is that I would start to question, as it's trading off between different instruments, I would start to question what I was hearing versus what I was imagining was there. And at some points, I couldn't even tell,
yeah, definitely.
which may be by design or not.
Well, that's the primary function of repetition in music, is your brain kind of naturally starts to imagine things that aren't actually happening, or changes that aren't actually happening, shifts in tempo and volume and things like that, which I think is fascinating. I love the tricks that the mind and the ear play when you're listening to very repetitive music.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me a little bit of, we mentioned a few episodes back, Tony Conrad, who goes a step beyond this with these long extended drones with that's just gradually shift over the course of like sometimes half an hour to an hour. If you go back to the beginning, you realize that there was a shift, but you almost can't detect it as you're sitting through that drawn out process.
Mm-hmm. And the contrasting melodies are similar enough where if you're not paying attention, you can kind of not even realize that it changed, but just think it's the same thing, and maybe you're hearing it differently,
This was in researching this, it was the first time I realized that there were two different melodies that play. I always thought it was just one, and then I was, I actually sit down and pay attention, I'm like, oh, there's kind of a counter melody that happens.
You know what it also reminds me of? Were either of you at the Cheer Accident set at the record store that I booked as part of one of the Already Dead family reunion festivals?
I wasn't, but I know what you're going to say. I heard about this experience.
Sure. So there's this long-running Chicago band called Cheer Accident that does a kind of weirdo prog kind of thing. And I booked them at a set, and one of the bands on the lineup had dropped, so there was extra time, and I told them if they wanted a longer set, they could. And they ended up playing this song. The title of it escapes me at the moment, but they played this song that has a section in the middle where they basically like lock into this short repetitive groove and then just hold it for what seems like an eternity to the people who are standing there watching the band. And it ended up being a really fascinating experience of not only hearing the music and hearing this very repetitive thing at length in loud volumes, but then also seeing how everybody's different reaction to it went. Some people, loved it and just zoned out and loved every minute of it. Some people stormed out. Some people were talking amongst themselves, being like, what the fuck am I listening to? Why won't they just change this riff? And the other thing that a lot of people experienced is a lot of people thought that they were hearing the tempo speed up or slow down, or hearing other elements that were being subtly added. And the band maintained that it was 100% the exact same thing with no change the whole time. But again, the intent was to make people have different impressions of what had happened based on, how they were taking it in and how they were experiencing it. So, some Ravel influence there for sure.
Very interesting. So a little background on this piece. It was composed in 1928, and Ravel had long entertained the idea of building a composition around a single theme which would slowly grow throughout with subtle shifts, and he described it as something consisting wholly of orchestral tissue without music. And Bolero's theme came to him while on holiday in southwestern France. Right before going for a swim, he played the melody on a piano for a friend and said, "Don't you think this theme has an insistent quality?" And it was informed by Ravel's interest in Spanish folk music, and it was based on a Spanish dance called Bolero. Ravel had a wide range of influences. He had interest in American jazz and blues. He had been on a North American tour just before starting to work on Bolero and had met George Gershwin on this tour. So he was crossing over to the other side, you know? And so he planned for this piece to repeat many times without any development, just one gradual crescendo. He began working in July of 1928 and completed it 5 months later, which sounds like a long time for a piece with so little changes, but this was actually fast for Ravel. He really was meticulous with his orchestration. It helped that there was a deadline because it was done for Russian dancer and friend Ida Rubinstein to choreograph. The piece, Bolero, was given its premiere at the Paris Opera on November 20th, 1928. Reportedly, a woman in the audience shouted that Ravel was a madman upon hearing the piece, and when Ravel was informed of this, he commented that it meant she understood the piece.
So that was like the classical version of someone yelling Judas.
Exactly.
Oh, uh-huh.
And it became a surprise success. Ravel thought orchestras would refuse to play this piece, you know, and nowadays it's played almost purely as an orchestral work, rarely staged as a ballet. In an interview, Ravel said, "I am particularly desirous there should be no misunderstanding about this work. It constitutes an experiment in a very special and limited direction and should not be suspected of aiming at achieving other or more than it actually does." So he kind of tried to downplay Bolero, and he, you know, although he considered it one of his least important works, it has always been his most popular. Go figure, right?
Yeah, that's just the case so often in the art world, it would seem.
We see it over and over. We've seen it many times talking about records on this podcast. So the majority of Bolero is in C major, and it's built over this unchanging rhythm on snare drums. Towards the very end, there's a brief, sudden modulation or key change to the key of E, although before it ends, it returns to C. And the bass drum, tam-tams, and cymbals make their entrance 6 bars from the end of the composition. So I can imagine this is like usually anywhere from 13 to 17 minutes when performed. So I think aside from the snares, the percussion section are just hanging around.
Just counting empty bars for like 16 minutes.
Yeah. So let's play the last couple minutes of Bolero and hear where it has how this theme, what it has developed into by this point. So we'll listen up to the end. what we haven't mentioned so far is that this is performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Serge Koussevitzky, a double bassist and conductor, considered one of the great conductors in the first half of the 20th century. He was Russian-born and was the music director of the Boston Symphony Orchestra for a long time, 1924 to 1949. He was actually, we mentioned at the top that this was on the RCA Victor Red Seal. He was one of the premier artists on this label. And I guess looking into what RCA Victor Red Seal is, basically it's premium content. It was considered to be the top artist, top tier type of stuff. I don't know if Sean, if you're at all familiar with that label or that concept.
Yeah, of all of the classical labels, that one seems to more often have records of some value and desirability. And I know a lot of their stuff is praised for its high pressing quality as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know for sure, but I think this copy we're listening to today is a 1950 pressing, and it's not by any means mint, but it's held up overall.
Yeah, this is officially the oldest record we've had on the show to date, right?
I think it ties with the Ima Sumac 1950. Although the performances date to 1947. They were done on different dates and locations, but both sides are from 1947. So yeah, we're going way back here.
Well, definitely the oldest pressing we've had on the show, then, at the very least.
I see what you're saying, because the Ima Sumac was definitely not a 1950 original.
Right.
Yeah, I gotcha. A few years after the success of Bolero, Ravel suffered a head injury in a taxi accident, and this is believed to have exacerbated a previously existing cerebral condition. Shortly before the composition of Bolero, friends had noticed an increased absent-mindedness in Ravel, and his interest in repetition may have been the result of the onset of either progressive aphasia or frontotemporal dementia, both of which are neurological syndromes that affect both memory and speech. That's actually the Radiolab episode that we talked about covers that, and someone who became obsessed with Bolero and had a similar condition. After the accident, Ravel struggled to complete his work, and he didn't compose the last few years of his life, although he is said to have remained socially and physically active. He died in Paris, France on December 28th, 1937, at the age of 62, 1 week after exploratory brain surgery. I believe they were trying to figure out what was going on with him. Today, he remains widely regarded as France's most popular composer. He's up there, for sure. And Bolero is the universal piece, but there's a lot more to his story and his music. Like I said, he was a master orchestrator. Some of the orchestrations he did for other people's pieces are very highly regarded. That was one of the key points my brother made when I was talking to him.
Yeah, and there's so much information as far as like the context of this. I mean, earlier Sean mentioned seeming overwhelmed by the amount of information. And if you think about it, the time frame of music we call classical is hundreds of years. And most of the music we talk about is just from the past 100 years. And we have, a billion different genre names, we call it all. And there's some division within classical into different periods, but even those are like 100-year periods. Yeah, so it's too much information for us to cover all here, but it is an endlessly interesting wormhole if you just keep digging.
Yeah, that is like the one thing I've noticed in the little bit of dipping my toes into the world of classical music is, yeah, when you look at it as just all of classical music, it's definitely overwhelming with the hundreds of years of material. But when you start to hear pieces that you like, then you can go into like, okay, what period was this made? What is the, movement that it's attributed to? And then you can find similar artists that appeal to you and kind of narrow into, certain periods of classical music, make it a little bit less overwhelming.
Yeah, you mentioned liking Mahler, and Mahler would have been like late Romantic era, which is what immediately preceded this. So it makes sense that you like this too.
Exactly.
Well, I'm so glad that you did all that studying of classical when you were younger, Jeremy.
I'll put you over my shoulder and carry us across the finish line. Don't worry.
Sean, what were you able to put together for a Spotify playlist for this episode?
Well, I can't take very much credit for this playlist because I'm not the one with the knowledge. So I got some good suggestions from you guys. I also pulled a few artists that I'd, read were associated with him or influential to him. And I tried to find songs on Spotify that were from older pressings that you can find easily, but the majority of material on Spotify is newer songs. So, not all of these are going to be the exact dollar bin copy that you will find, but if you like some of these composers and songs, etc., then it's a good starting point of where to start looking in those classical bins. So we start off with a version of Bolero, and then you'll also hear works from Debussy. Is that how it's pronounced?
Debussy?
Debussy.
I think so.
I always said Debussy, and I'm always wrong about pronunciation. So,
well, hopefully one of us is close enough. I also put one of the parts of Verkalt Nacht. I'm probably mispronouncing that as well, but I remember Jeremy telling me a few months ago that that was one of his all-time favorite classical pieces by Schoenberg. I put that in there. Also, here's some works from Shostakovich, other tracks from Ravel, some Rachmaninoff, Stravinsky, and then just for a oddball context to show much later how this music has influenced other music, put a track by Joe Walsh. That was your suggestion, Peter. Do you want to tell people why there's a Joe Walsh track on this playlist?
Yeah. The last piece that we're going to listen to is the first movement of the Mother Goose suite, Pavan of Sleeping Beauty. And Joe Walsh recorded a synthesized version of this on his 1974 album, So What? That's what we're going to be leaving on. And that's just like Joe Walsh. I mean, it actually makes sense. Like if I think about, I don't want to admit this, but what Joe Walsh brought to the Eagles. If I think about that, like I think there were a lot of the 70s rock guitarists actually were very inspired by classical music that kind of paved the way for, these harmonized dual guitars. Like Boston, they were really inspired by classical music. Jeff Beck, I believe you also put something by him on the playlist, Sean?
Yeah, Beck has a version of Bolero from his album Truth that I put on the playlist. In some slight similarities, I feel like the more you get into classical music, the more you start to hear the influence or, quotes from passages in other styles of music, in the same way that getting into soul and hip hop music will make you like hear a soul song and be like, oh, I know the sample from this hip hop track. You kind of get like, those similar moments of realization the more you listen to classical music. Because yeah, a lot of these classical composers were very influential to certain rock bands and especially a lot of jazz artists, particularly the more adventurous, like free jazz styled artists were all very influenced by classical music.
Well, of course, coming full circle to what Jeremy said at the top, a lot of krautrock stuff, Can being one of them, they were studying underneath, what's his name? I'm blanking on him. Stockhausen. Those guys were studying classical, avant-garde classical. And so I have to think this piece wouldn't have even been that old in the 1960s. It would have been like 40 years old.
Yeah, definitely.
And, probably still fairly radical.
Wow, that's like as old as the message is
Yeah.
to us now.
Yeah, that's about exactly right. The early 1980s. But things moved differently, I feel like, in the first to middle half of the 20th century.
Yeah, there's a whole different set of changes in society there.
Yeah, there were like wars going on. That kind of broke things up too
Yeah.
on a world scale. Yeah, so honestly, I was even thinking about the fact that this may have even had an influence on pop music as far as like repeated sections over and over without much variation. That's largely
Mhm.
what a lot of pop music is.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that we're on the subject of rock music influenced by classical, I'm going to add a track by the New York Rock and Roll Ensemble to this playlist after we're done recording this episode.
Oh, I have a record by them sitting in my episodes to do pile.
I believe they're also on my episodes to-do list as well. So someday we're going to get real hyped on some New York Rock and Roll Ensemble. Dollar
Yeah.
Bin Classic.
Yeah, we've long talked about doing something by them. And I don't know them. So you guys got to bring it. Teach
We
me.
will.
Well, any closing thoughts before we go out on...
I was thinking about this, and for whatever reason, I feel a need to defend classical vinyl collectors right now.
Fair enough.
Because I know people like Sean are just judging them endlessly because they have a stereotype of being extremely particular about their equipment and the quality of the records and knowing which pressings are what. And I just want to throw out there, though, if you listen to this or almost any other piece, the dynamic range between the quiet parts and the loud parts are way huger difference than almost all pop and rock and soul and everything else. So I think there is some legitimacy to that, though I also, this has nothing to do with the classical people, but I'm going to out myself a little here as a soccer card collector. and people get their cards graded by these companies. And my buddy who's also into it sent me this link because he knows I'm really into vinyl and have this podcast. And they're now grading vinyls. Like you send your vinyl to this place and they will grade how mint of condition it's in. And then they'll play it just one time and record it digitally so that you don't have to play it again and damage it any further. And then they give you a digital copy for you to listen to.
Oh, wow. I knew that they did that kind of grading with cards when I got out all my baseball cards from my youth, my big investments that I made for the future when I was younger, and thought I was, ready to cash in, and then found out there was this whole new system in place that it sounded like way too much of a bother.
Well, I now feel the need to defend myself a little bit now that Jeremy's been making these claims about my opinions about classical collectors. I've got nothing but love for the majority of classical collectors. Some of them can be a real pain in the ass and real picky about stuff, but I completely agree with Jeremy that it kind of comes with the territory of being a classical music collector, because so many of these records have such a wide dynamic range that if you're hearing even slight pops and clicks during the quiet section, they're so much more noticeable than when you're listening to a rock record where all the instruments are just kind of, the dynamic shift is between 8 and 10, not 1 and 10, like on classical records. So it completely makes sense to me. Also, there is one group of people that will always annoy me way more than classical collectors, and that's people that say the word vinyls.
I knew it was going to come around to that.
So you can go to hell, sir. That's what I'm saying.
Oh,
I'll admit my argument was a straw man argument. Sean wasn't really the one saying that. I just used him as a stand-in.
he likes to project on Sean because he can.
Yeah.
It's fair. I'll take it.
Well, all good points. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we wrap this up?
Just that my name's Jeremy Ruggles, and you've been listening to I'd Buy That for $1.
I'm Sean Hartman, and I must agree that you have been listening to I'd Buy That for $1.
And I will jump in and support what these two gents are saying. If you'd like to support us, check out patreon.com/I'd Buy That podcast. All kinds of cool extra bonus content there. And I am Peter Cook. You have been listening to I'd Buy That for $1, and we are going to leave you with Pavan of Sleeping Beauty by Maurice Ravel from the Mother Goose Suite, as performed by the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Goodbye.